Thank you for having me here today. I know that these topics are topics that are not new. They've been spoken about for quite some time. Implicit bias has been around for 20 plus years. The concept of microaggressions has been around since the 70s, but really didn't hit the mainstream of many contexts until around 2007, 2008, so a little bit newer of a concept. As we talk about these issues, I think it's good to think about the context that we live in. And so what is a primary or a couple issues that are on the minds of nearly every American and probably most people around the world right now? Coronavirus and election. Good, good. Yes. So as we think about implicit bias and how I conceptualize microaggressions are kind of the manifestations of implicit biases that we have, I think it's good to think about the context that we navigate and how implicit biases really do impact a number of domains. And looking at the spread of candidates that we had initially, there are a few others that are not included in this photo. We know as of today, I believe Elizabeth Warren just announced that she was dropping out as well. And so who are we left with? Right. And what are we noticing in terms of differences if we just look visually?
One has glasses.
One has glasses, yeah. White hair. Yeah, we notice every single woman has been has eliminated or dropped out. Every person of color has dropped out. The only queer identified person has also dropped out. And it's not to say that those are the only issues that we take into consideration when making our decisions, but implicit biases do impact us in some ways. And I was happy that when I was watching some of the newscasts on Super Tuesday, that a commentator did mention gender bias very briefly. Probably deserved a bit more attention in terms of why Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar weren't getting as many votes and had dropped out earlier. So just to think about it as a context as we're going on, especially since it's on the forefront of many people's minds and experiences. The other one, coronavirus, right? And so we might be thinking, how does implicit bias impact coronavirus? Well, if we look at this New York Times Instagram post, our first reported case in New York was someone who was traveling in Iran and had returned to Manhattan. Yet this image here is of, can anybody discern possibly the race? Asian. And this was in New York City. We have 3 Chinatowns, one located in Flushing, Queens, where I work. And this is where this is from. So what does that have to do with someone who went to Iran and lives in Manhattan, right? So again, going off of a gross stereotype of coronavirus. Of course, it did originate in Wuhan, China. We know that as a fact, or at least we think we know that as a fact. We know that they're containing it in many ways. We know it's spread across the world, yet the media still is portraying Asians as kind of the center point of the coronavirus and related issues. And so thinking about what kind of messages is that sending? Having spoken and having many Asian students and also Asian colleagues, I've heard them report that they've been the targets of various microaggressions related to coronavirus. One of my really dear friends, who's another psychologist, Chinese-American professor from Columbia, Maryland, at Hunter College. She was doing an event on mental health, and somebody came up to her, and the first question was, "Are you from the mainland?" And she knew what the intended message was there, but was kind of struck by that was the first question that she was asked, and she had never really been asked that question, and so she just responded, "I'm from Columbia, Maryland," and kind of left it as that. But just thinking about the numbers, or the types of aggressions and experiences that our colleagues, our students, or ourselves might be kind of enduring as a kind of byproduct of the coronavirus and how it's being reported and how people are conceptualizing it. So who here is familiar with implicit bias already? Good, good. I see lots of hands going up. Who here has taken an implicit associations test? A few of you. Okay, I'll be giving you a resource for the rest of you that might want to take it to kind of see where you fall on various domains. So I'm not going to pretend or even claim that I am the originator. No, it is a group of 3 scholars, Mahzarin Banaji at Harvard, and Anthony Greenwald and Brian Nosek are the originators of the implicit associations test and are the scholars that are credited with bringing implicit bias to the forefront of our awareness. And using Dr. Banaji's words, the best we can think about implicit bias is that it is a collection of all the experiences we have had in the world. Right? So all the experiences we've had from birth to death. Right? From birth, we are socialized into many aspects of how we are to behave, how we are to speak, the languages that we use, the accents that we develop, right? The cultural customs that we come to appreciate and value, and those that we also come to devalue. We learn what's right, what's wrong, right, from an early age. And then over the course of our lives, those are either reinforced or challenged in various ways. And so these implicit biases, again, develop very early, but are also reinforced as we develop. Dr. Banaji even goes on to talk about our brain, right? And humans have a very special brain. It's learned to detect information in the world as it sees it, stores it, and then not have to recompute it every time. What's another word for that process? That's it? It's a heuristic. Heuristic, stereotypes, right? Oftentimes when we hear the word stereotype, we might think of negative connotations, but they're just our ways of navigating a complicated world with complicated processes that we have as individuals, and to do it effectively. So every time that I pull this out, I know the function of it automatically, right? I don't have to relearn how to use this because of all the stereotypes that I've learned and have embedded in my brain so that I can use this really effectively. Think about it even in terms of, I see someone using a fork over there. I'm sure you didn't have to relearn what that fork was in order to know how to put food on it and then put it into your mouth. So stereotypes can be very helpful. But when we apply them to people and to experiences and to notions and ideas, that's when it can kind of enter dangerous territory. And so our brains, they're very complex. They allow us to have higher order thinking and reasoning and what have you, but they're also kind of very lazy in a way in terms of relying on stereotypes a bit too much in terms of being able to understand and navigate the world around us. And so I don't have to say it, Dr. Banaji said it, our brains are screwed up, right? So I think that we should just maybe start there. They do not learn accurately, right? These stereotypes have kind of gone awry. The uniqueness of implicit biases is that they are different from known biases. I'm sure that we are aware of many biases that we have. We have preferences for foods, right? For different colors, for different clothing. We might even be aware of the different biases that we have towards different groups based off of gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, nativity, geography, etc. We might be aware of some of those, but some of them run very deeply where we're not quite aware of them. Because they're so ingrained in our personas. Again, these things have been ingrained in us since birth, right? Before we were even making conscious decisions about what to accept and what not to accept. And so many of these we inherited, right, without our consent even. So they're kind of inaccessible. Even if we try to access them via introspection, we're still going to have a bias in terms of what that bias is, if you mean. So even if you know you have a bias for something in particular, our reporting of it is often much less significant than how significant it actually is. Does that make sense? Right. And so we develop across the lifespan exposure to direct and indirect messages, right? So some things we're told, this is what you should do, this is how you should act, this is what you should speak. But there are many messages that come to us indirectly. So if we just look at various messages across society, this is direct or indirect? Pretty direct. We know what these signs are saying, right? We know the messages that are being propagated. It's not really difficult to interpret what's being said here, right? So that's I actually prefer much more direct messaging because I don't have to interpret it then, right? We can go to other things as well in terms of the messages that are sent, especially if we think about our college campuses. This data comes from the National Center for Educational Statistics. It's as if all of the colleges and universities were one aggregate institution, and this is kind of how the faculty and student demographics fall. And we know that most of the student demographics are not in alignment with the general population. We go over to the faculty side. Who here are faculty, by chance? Right? Who are students? And who are administration or staff roles? Okay, so we have a nice mix of people. We often focus on student numbers when we think about diversity and inclusion issues. Faculty numbers are often thought about as well, usually from a human resource perspective, but really aren't analyzed as much as they should be. And if we look here, I identify as Latino, and I'm a faculty. However, I only represent 4%, right? And if we think about the kinds of messaging that sends students, right, who are coming to classes where they spend most of their time on a campus, hopefully, with us, and let's say you're an accounting major, yet you never have a professor that kind of matches your demographic, right? What kind of message does that send to the student, both directly and indirectly, about their place in that profession, right? Or just walking around campus. If a student or a faculty or a staff doesn't see people that look or reflect who they are, both in terms of on the surface and culturally, they're not having that appropriate mirroring that we know from developmental psychology is necessary in order to develop and optimize who we are as people. So it's good to think about what are our demographics like on campus, and what are those indirect messages that are being sent to our population. We look to the media. I use a lot of media examples in my talks because it's actually just really easy to get these examples because the media operates off of stereotype. That's how they sell their products, right? They maximize that in a very insidious and gross and profitable way. So we look at this ad for Nivea. I actually used to use Nivea products before I saw this one. White is purity. We'll be thinking, well, what is wrong with that, right? White is often equated with clean, right? But white is also used as the name of a racial group. And we can't untie those things apart. And so those inevitably are going to be tied together. And so this messaging can send, again, that can support the notions of white superiority and leading to white supremacy, et cetera, where it gets really ugly. So again, this might be more of an indirect messaging that people are experiencing, depending on your level of awareness, but still kind of supports these implicit biases that we might develop. We even look across history. This is an older ad. Who's this person? Mr. Clean, right? Kind of a common household name. This is a French ad. Maybe it was in Canada or in France, probably from the 50s or 60s or something, based off of what they're wearing. But it sends a lot of messages without even having to write them, right? How much space is this figure taking up? Nearly half of the image, right? And then the person doing the work with the product is in the background. And gender-wise, probably identified as a woman, right? Whose role is to use this strong product to clean the house. And also to do it in a way that's she's dressed up, right? And so you also have to be put together all the time, even while you're cleaning. Who dresses up like that to clean? I sure don't, right? And so many messages are being sent just via this one communication in terms of gender dynamics and roles that genders are supposed to kind of uphold. Fast forward, we know Swiffers are a relatively new invention. I use one. However, messaging around Swiffers and even contemporary household products still portray a similar message, even if it's a bit more subtle. So we see the primary figure is at least larger, taking up more space. However, still the gender role is kind of indicated there, where she's the one responsible for cleaning. That may be her husband or son, I'm not quite sure, but is just there working and doing something that is more intellectual as well. So we also have ascription of intelligence is a microaggression category that's been identified across various groups where women are often deemed less intelligent than men, especially across very specific industries and what have you. But this kind of propagates that message in a somewhat indirect way if you're not aware. When men are kind of the primary, I didn't include an ad like this, primary figure in a household product, we often see that man is often fumbling around with how to use the Swiffer or how to clean. Then the woman comes and kind of shows him how to do it correctly. So while they're still trying to kind of maybe espouse or convey some kind of egalitarianism related to household chores, it still kind of fails, right? Because it's saying the man is not good at it, so the woman should just do it anyway. And then this one, this is probably the absolute worst ad I've ever seen in my life. So it came from Bloomingdale's holiday catalog a few years ago. It says, "Spike your best friend's eggnog when they're not looking." Right. And then we see this person looking kind of creepy, even just the way he's kind of cut out of there, kind of like a peeping Tom. She's just there laughing, and he's thinking whatever he's thinking in his mind. I don't need to repeat them. But it conveys not only stereotypes or biases about gender and power dynamics between genders, but it also conveys messaging about different social norms and ideas that we have regarding sexuality, right? So the implicit association test, which I'm happy to see has been developed even further to go beyond how we kind of develop implicit biases or have implicit biases about sociocultural groups, and is now kind of spread into different domains of life and thoughts. So how people think about sexuality, how people think about substances like marijuana and alcohol, how people think about mental health. We know there's a lot of mental health stigma out there, and there are implicit biases that help to kind of uphold those stigmas that exist. Yeah, so thankfully they removed this, or actually they didn't remove it, it was printed. It was in a printed catalog, so they couldn't just go and delete it from their website or what have you. And what makes me think of the marketing teams, I know how I do consulting with marketing firms. I know that these have to pass many, many eyes, right? And I know that women probably even had to look at this, but I don't blame the women for this occurring, because they probably weren't in the position of power, or they had the catch-22 experience. Whenever we have to, when I talk about microaggressions, whenever we have to interact with a microaggression, there's a risk that you take when you kind of reveal it to somebody, right? You're either going to receive more microaggressions by saying that you're making a big deal out of nothing, or you're going to be labeled a wave maker or a troublemaker, right? So there's that risk, and so I don't blame people for not doing that, but I do blame the people that are in charge and who had the final sign-off. So we don't just think about what's included, but omission is also important to think about, right? Which experiences, which voices, which faces are not included. We often don't see good representations of queer families in the media in a positive way. We rarely see representation of ability issues, and we are seeing more, thankfully, but still not up to par with representations of people of color in the media and across industry. So omission is also harmful. So when we're looking at something, we should not only think about what are the messages being sent about what's included there, but what are the messages also being sent about who's not being included in that narrative, which also sends that message of belonging and inclusion. So just some facts. We all have these. Nobody is immune from implicit biases, but that does not give us permission to just kind of ignorantly ignore it, right? Some implicit bias trainings that I've heard about have kind of done damage, because all they do is tell people they're implicitly biased without kind of further explaining how the biases came to develop and what you can possibly do to address them. And then people often will just excuse themselves or recuse themselves of having to do that work because they weren't kind of taught how to do it. So they don't necessarily align with our declared beliefs. Surveys often show that most Americans will indicate that they are egalitarian in nature, right? That they believe that everybody deserves the same treatment and the same rights and the same protections as everyone. However, those don't translate to how people vote. Those don't translate to how people treat each other. Those don't translate into the policies and procedures that we use to govern the institutions that we belong in. In general, we favor our in-groups, right? That's probably evolutionary in nature or biological, right? That there is this preference that we have for those that look like us, that have similar beliefs. And that's not necessarily wrong in nature. It's wrong when we kind of use that as the litmus for what is right and wrong in general, when we start to apply that to other people. But the good news is that we can change these with intentional learning. Right? We can't just pretend that our implicit biases are going to be harnessed in or at least acknowledged by themselves. Right? We have to intentionally unlearn these biases by interrogating the biases that we learn about ourselves. And I'll provide some process questions at the end, and continually questioning, how do these manifest in our lives? What role am I playing in terms of perpetuating these biases? And how are they impacting those around me? So 20 plus years of implicit bias. So in 1998, yes, is when I believe the test came out. And so in 2018, there was a big article and even some celebration about the 20-year anniversary of it. So 20 plus years of this research, millions of people have taken the IAT through this mechanism. And time again, the aggregate of this data show that most people will have a moderate to strong preference for racially white people over racially black people, irrespective of race. So even people of color will have a moderate to strong preference for racially white people. People will also favor young over old people regardless of age as well, right? And so those are two of the primary themes that come out again and again, time after time, decade after decade, in terms of the biases that still are kind of upheld in society because of all this messaging, both direct and indirect, about favored groups and unfavorable groups. Now, how does this translate into real life situations, right? And so I love the implicit bias framework, but we can't just stop there. We have to think about what are the manifestations of these biases. And so microaggressions are one of the manifestations of implicit biases, and I'll explain that a bit more after this. Stereotype threat. Who's familiar with stereotype threat? Yes. Who can tell me what that is? I'm tired of talking. Go for it.
It's just the idea that people are affected by stereotypes that they know, like going to a test, for instance. Like if women go into a test, hearing that women perform poorly or kind of have that knowledge going into it, then they'll perform more poorly. But if they're told, for instance, on this particular test, women actually do as well as men, then their scores go up.
Yep. So that's actually a good intervention for addressing stereotype threat in the moment. All you have to do is be reminded of your group. So whenever there's a demographic questionnaire in front of a standardized test, that's already going to bias the test, because if your group is stereotyped in a negative way when it comes to intellectual capabilities, so many people of color and women, they're automatically going to do poor, right? But if you're reminded of it, if you're given that kind of framework, if you're saying you're going to perform just as well, that kind of erases or helps to erase or buffer that negative impact. Imposter phenomenon, something that I struggle with on a daily basis, especially because I am a numeric minority in my chosen profession. I don't see a whole lot of mirrors around me all the time. Thankfully, I'm in a department that is fairly diverse, but in general, it's not the case. And so it's that idea that these messages have kind of been ingrained in us about the deficits that society says we have, and also compounded with the lack of representation, that people start to feel that they're an imposter. Even when they've achieved at great lengths, they still have those imposter beliefs. And some quick things that you can do is just teaching your students about imposter phenomenon, letting them know what it is, and you're probably going to have some lights turn on because they might not even have the framework or knowledge for what this experience is that they're going through. But just knowing that about what it is can be the antidote to reducing the harmful impact on their performance and their self-esteem and self-worth. Whenever I have an imposter message going on, I know now just to say that's the imposter talking, that's not the real David Rivera talking. And that kind of helps to buffer it for me in the moment. Also, continually assessing and making note of your strengths. We don't do that in our society too much. One exercise I have my students do when they introduce themselves is to not only give their name, but also to give a strength of theirs for first day of class. And that activity can actually last the entire class period because some students are just really find it difficult to find a strength. When I ask them about their challenges, they can list a million challenges in 10 seconds. But a strength, they have a hard time. And some of it might do with modesty, but I just don't think our culture promotes that in a very effective way. And so continually reminding yourself of your strengths. Dignitary harm is a relatively, well, it's not even been written about yet. I heard Kimberly Crenshaw, the critical race theorist and an intersectionality scholar, speak a few years ago, and she mentioned that dignitary harm is likely to occur when someone feels that not all aspects of their identity and personhood are valued or appreciated, where they feel they have to hide a part of themselves because it's going to be devalued. And that causes harm to dignity. And in my mind, I started thinking about what is dignity, right? It's our sense of self-worth, right? It's our sense that we deserve good things to happen to us, which is a part of kind of self-actualization, right? And so if our dignity is compromised, that's going to lead to probably a whole host of negative compromises that we're going to encounter. So I think it's something we should also think about. What are our students and what are our senses of self-worth, and how might they be impacted by the sociocultural issues that we navigate? Mental health compromises, so I'm a psychologist, I'd be remiss if I did not mention them. All of these things have been shown in study after study to lead to negative compromises in mental health. Development of possibly anxiety and depression disorders. It also impacts help-seeking behaviors. So if a student is walking around your campus and is feeling threats of microaggressions, and they're having some kind of compromise develop because of that, they're less likely to seek help from your institution or any institution that they identify as being a harmful target, right? Which kind of makes sense. Why are we going to want to go seek help from a place that we feel is harming us in some kind of way? Right? So we can have the best interventions available, the best supports, but if the student is feeling that that's a harmful, negative place to go seek services, they're not going to go. Racial spotlighting and ignoring happens in classroom situations often to people who are visibly a minority in that class. And I use the term minority only to denote really its true sense of the word, meaning less number, not lesser than in terms of how it's currently used. But they are often spotlighted to be kind of the voice and representation for their entire cultural group, which we know is just unfair. Who can possibly be that voice? All you can do is be the voice of your own person. Or they're ignored, right? They're not called on. Or if they share an answer, that answer isn't validated until somebody else shares the same answer, and then that's validated. So thinking about how students who might be the numeric minority in the classroom are treated is important. And all these things can lead to what we don't want to happen, right? Academic disengagement, right? Which probably means that they're probably going to suffer in terms of their grades as well, unless they happen just to be a genius and participation and attendance isn't a part of the equation. But academic disengagement is what we often see as being the ramification. And again, we're all here to engage our students academically, regardless of the role that you play at the institution. Everyone from the president to somebody who might be in a service role is responsible for student success in many ways. All right, so microaggressions, who's heard of these before? Hopefully many people. This is awesome. When I first started doing these talks in around 2008, 2009, nobody knew about them. Now they've kind of taken off. So we know these are the brief, commonplace exchanges that people have, not only with people interpersonally, but also with the environment around us. Those might even enter the macroaggression territory. So macroaggressions are not overt forms of microaggression as people tend to think of them as. They are the policies, they're the structures that kind of communicate hostility, derogation to whole groups of people at the same time. So they kind of carry a lot of weight, and you don't really need anybody to even interact with you for them to have an impact. So they communicate these harmful messages. They're often unintentional, right? The person communicating them, because of, again, how insidious and how deeply interwoven our implicit biases are and how we're unaware of them, we just communicate them and we're not even aware of them. And even the person receiving them, because of how they've been socialized, might not even be aware that they're happening as well. They might just feel kind of funky or what have you, especially if they don't have a microaggression framework to operate from. So they're often at the level of unawareness in these communications where people don't kind of understand. So they kind of fly by the radar without being even acknowledged. Some of the defining characteristics, and I'll go into these a bit deeper for those of you coming to the 4:30, is that 4:30? 420 workshop. So there are 4 defining characteristics, which are really the theoretical underpinnings of microaggression. So the clash of realities, meaning that we all have our own unique worldview, the way that we understand and make sense of the world around us based off of all of our experiences and our sociocultural makeup. And so inevitably, whenever we meet somebody else, there's an opportunity for a microaggression to occur, right? 'Cause there's going to be a difference in perspective there. So that's already an automatic. There's the invisibility of unintentional expressions of bias. So when they're left unchecked, they're invisible, right? And so that invisibility kind of just lets them kind of live, right, without being checked. And that's also because they're subtle, because they're covert, because people often communicate them at the unconscious level of awareness, they just kind of happen. Perceived minimal harm. So when I get to some of the microaggression examples, one of them by themselves isn't going to cause somebody to develop a mental health issue, isn't probably going to cause someone to disengage academically, but it's the accumulation of them, right? And so in the research that we do, we look at people's experiences with them over a certain set of time, right? And we find that the more microaggression experiences one reports, the more serious or significant that outcome is for them. And then there's that catch-22 that I kind of already explained, that damned if you do, damned if you don't. So if I am aware of these, I experience them, and if I don't reply, I'm forced to kind of live with it in my personhood for a while. If I do reply, I'm going to probably get, I didn't mean that, or you're overreacting, which are another forms of microaggressions that are invalidating my experience, or I'm going to be labeled, if it's in a professional setting, as a troublemaker. Right? Or if it's coming from somebody who is hierarchically above me, I kind of stand to lose maybe some social or political capital, right? So there's lots of risk with responding. And so later on today, I'll teach you about some ways that we can respond in effective ways. So what are students saying? This was from a BuzzFeed campaign that students at Fordham University did several years ago. And these are some common things that I still hear my students say, and some things that I even experience myself. So this one right here has to do with racial spotlighting, right? The limited representation of my race in your classroom does not make me the voice of all black people. In the middle, where are you really from? So asking where you're from, that's not a microaggression, right? Especially on college campuses where folks, I think you have students from 47 plus states living here, right? So it would make sense, and from a number of countries that people ask, where are you from? So if I say I'm from Wyoming, and they're like, no, where are you really from? I'm like, I'm from Cheyenne. No, where are you really from? The south side of Cheyenne? No, where are you really? And I'm like, are you asking what my nativity is or where my ancestors are from? Okay, that's a different question. And that means that you're assuming something about me too. So it becomes a microaggression when that first answer is not taken as the real answer, and it's like, no, where are you really from? And you see her rolling her eyes up. I'm used to hearing this all the time. They probably think that she's from somewhere in Asia, right? And so again, it's also reinforcing a very common microaggression for Asian Americans, Latinx people, and Muslim Americans of being a perpetual foreigner. And that's their language. I don't like using the term foreigner. They even use language like, I feel like I'm an alien in my own land, right? So even non-human, because people don't see me as such. And this is even being related to the political landscape and how that's being covered, where when I was watching Super Tuesday as well, they said the most important racial groups, blacks and Latinos, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, oh, is that really true? Are we the most important? And so what does that mean for Asian Americans and all the other groups, right? So it's a further erasure of their existence, and also of, if you're not politically engaged, that also then questions your Americanness in some ways, right? So that idea of the perpetual foreigner is still propagated through that kind of language. And this last one's my favorite, because I get this all the time. I don't mean like favorite because I liked it, but because I just get it often. So when I gave a speech about racism, which is what I'm kind of doing, the MC introduced me as Jaime Garcia. My name is Jaime Rodriguez. Not all Latinos have the last name Garcia. I can't tell you, I started to form a list of all the different last names that people have used to introduce me, not only in person, but also via email to the entire campus community, where my last name was either Ramirez or Rodriguez or Gonzalez or Martinez, right? All great names. I love those names, but that's not my last name, right? So what does that say to the person who's kind of being aggressive in that way? You didn't take the time to learn my name. How come? Then I noticed my counterparts who are not Latino, those names are often not kind of misrepresented or like that. So when it happens time and time again, it's happened in classes as well, and thankfully I was able to address it, but it just kind of eats at your sense of self, of like, do people even care to know who I really am? How are they really valuing me? We could think about sexual orientation and gender identity as well. So another BuzzFeed campaign that was done a few years ago on these two issues. The first one, she is lesbian identified. Have you ever had real sex? So the implication here is that real sex only occurs with the penis, right? Not to be too graphic, but that's what's being communicated there. And if you've never had that kind of sex, you haven't had real sex. In the middle, actually a close friend of mine, are you a man or a woman? It's actually a psychologist who works in the VA system. This is how they typically dress in gender non-binary clothing, and they're often asked this question. And in order to kind of address these, what they've done is actually started to dress in gender stereotypic clothing at work so that they can avoid these kinds of questions. And so they're being forced to dress in a costume that really is a costume to them and does not match their internal sense of self. The last one's also a friend of mine, talking about maybe asking some colleagues out for happy hour to a gay bar. But when I get hit on at a gay bar, and I'm like, well, if you're getting hit on, take it as a compliment, if it's warranted. And if there's, we're not going to cross any lines here. But anyhow, but that's that idea of gay men being hypersexualized, right? And that's the only thing that's on their mind. Or even sexual predators kind of enters into that territory. All right, so what can we do? So reflect on your known biases, right? Your known biases can give you an idea about what your implicit bias might be. And as I mentioned, we're often going to rate our known biases as actually being not as insidious or grave or as big of an issue as our implicit association test is going to tell us about them. Right? It's often going to give us a different narrative that's actually stronger. Right? So if you haven't taken it, if you go to www.implicit.harvard.edu, you'll have the list of various socio-demographic groups that you can kind of test your biases against, if you will. That's the proper wording. And also these other ideas and issues, such as mental health, different substances, etc. We need to develop policies and procedures that emphasize diversity, inclusion, and equity. Again, because a lot of microaggressions live at the macro level that are embedded in these policies, which propagate them without anybody even having to do anything, they're going to continue to exist. So we need to change the structures as much as we can. And then to continually expand our worldview, meaning that those groups that we don't know much about, make contact with them, learn about them. We have the internet, you have your phone, right? So there's many ways that we can continuously make ourselves aware about these various groups and experiences that maybe we might not quite know much about. So I think that could be a helpful thing. Some questions that you might want to take away with you before I'm going to stop for some Q&A is, again, how do you see these manifesting in your life, right? So taking pause in any setting and just like looking around, because you're going to see representations of implicit biases and microaggressions. What ways do you contribute? We all contribute. I microaggress on a daily basis. I'm aware of it, thank God, but I microaggress regularly, and I'm an expert in it. So I'm not immune from it. Nobody is immune from any of these. When I take the implicit association test, and I do it every so often, I don't like the results I see because it's revealing these biases that are still there, right? But at least what it does, it makes me acknowledge it, and it makes me then question, well, what are the things I'm doing to propagate this, and what do I need to do to intentionally unlearn kind of these thoughts and what have you that lead to the behaviors that can then lead to microaggressions. And then what are the ways that we can support students, right? So we can teach them about these things, right? That's our job, right, to teach them about various things. And we know that these intersect all of our domains. Some people might think, oh, it makes sense for psychology and sociology, but what about for me? I'm like, yeah, well, it's probably impacts your industry too. So we can always find some kind of connection to whatever work or role or discipline that we're in to implicit biases and microaggressions. And so training our students how to deal with these and the psychosocial impacts, you know, the microaggressions, the imposter phenomenon, the stereotype threat, etc., can arm them with tools that they can then use to help defend themselves and guard themselves from the negative impacts. So I'm going to stop there. Are there questions that folks might have for me? Thank you. Yes?
You showed some advertisements from, I think, the 60s or 70s, and then some more modern ones. I was wondering if the implicit biases and microaggressions have decreased over time? In other words, are we heading in the right direction of being more aware?
I think they've increased. Not only microaggressions, but there's been an increase over the past few years, coincidentally, not coincidentally, of overt forms of hate that have been reported. Yeah, so I think that as we see them more, so it's actually a hard question to answer because before we had the framework, I had no idea what these were, and I was experiencing them from childhood through that time. And so it might just be that we're more aware of them and we're seeing them, but I know that there has been a rise on overt forms of hate and discrimination as of recent. I think that we probably are making inroads in terms of equipping people with the knowledge about them, but society is society, and again, the media is a huge propagator of these, and they have not stopped. And they continue to support and uphold these biases in very meaningful ways, unfortunately. And so I hope that we're on the right direction. You know, I think you bringing me here is in the right direction. Many colleges and universities that are taking up the mantle of DEI work is also a good sign. So I am hopeful, but I don't think that they've actually decreased. Yeah. And I'm actually hopeful that they're probably ever going to. As long as we continue to have our various identities and living in multicultural societies are probably going to persist. Hopefully the impact is what can go down. Yeah. Other questions? Comments? Even points of disagreement?
You said that you commit, I don't know if commit is the word, microaggressions regularly. I'd be curious how somebody who's so sensitive to it, could you give us an example?
Yeah, I can. So I said commit. When I talk about these as well, I think language is extremely important. And so I don't like using terms like perpetrator and what have you. I like using enactor, right? Because like I mentioned, society taught us to be this way. Nobody was born an ist of anything or microaggressive, right? We learned these things. And so we're enacting what society has taught us. That doesn't mean we don't take responsibility for it. And so when I do commit them, so last night, having dinner with my Asian American psychologist friend, and was talking about a couple Asian American professors, one that works at NYU and one that works at the New School. And she's like, well, have you spoken to Sumi about that? And then I said, well, I'm not going to go to the New School. She's like, oh, Sumi's at NYU. The other professor's at the New School, and both are Asian American. And I'm like, that was a microaggression on my part. So I caught it very quickly, and I just said that was a microaggression, and we moved on with the conversation. Even things as like even just the thoughts that I might have about let me think. Even gender will enter the picture, where the ideas that we have about gender are so strong, and so I'll notice myself opening the door more for women than for men, right? And now that should be a courtesy thing, but why am I just opening it for women? What's that belief that I have deep down inside? Is it only about politeness? Or might it be that I think that they need work done for them for some reason, because that's what I was taught. That as a man, I need to make sure that I'm taking care of them because they're weaker. So those are the messages that I was taught. Not from my mom. I was raised by a single woman. She taught me that women are very strong. But society has taught me that in many ways. And so how I combat that is I open it for everybody, right? Everybody should have, I want the door open for me, right? Why don't we do that, right? But those are some examples of how I might, or I might even be quick to help a woman who's carrying some packages, right? Do you need some help? But a man doing it, I might not ask him for help, right? Yeah. What other questions or thoughts? Sean?
This is a kind of twofold question. So the first is, it seems that I'm wondering whether a logical corollary of the framework, the microaggression framework that you describe, is that individuals trade microaggressions. In other words, that it isn't just flowing always in one direction, but it might be a feature of communication. Mm-hmm. So then one is a kind of secondary question then is in evaluating the kind of consequence, impact, response to those microaggressions, are issues such as power and intention parts of the framework where you then evaluate the differences between those microaggressions? I mean, that's really what I'm interested in getting.
So the power and privilege and oppression dynamic is at the top, right? Knowing that all the structures in society were built, right, for the promotion of a certain set of people at the expense of everyone else, and that's how they continue to operate. So privilege and oppression are definitely up there on the top. Intentionality, that one is trickier because the microaggression framework does challenge previous notions and theories of discrimination, broadly speaking, where intent was kind of the hallmark, that in order for it to be something harmful, that person needs to have intended it to be harmful. And when we have microaggression conversations, it often gets stuck at the intention point of view. And I don't think I honestly don't have those conversations because I can't get into your brain and really figure out what your intent really was. I think that the impact conversation is the more useful one to have because that's what happened. When we think about the law, right, the law actually has mechanisms in place for punishing people who don't intend or didn't intend to commit the crime that they committed, right? If someone doesn't intend to kill somebody, what do we call that? Manslaughter, right? So we have a word for that, right? And they're still going to be charged. But in our everyday interactions, if we don't intend to do something, that often erases then any culpability, right? No, I didn't intend to, so that means I'm fine. I can just walk away. But I'm still left here, like with my dignity not intact, or with these cognitive resources that are so precious having been sapped, that then lead me to then not be able to do my job as functionally as I should be doing it, right? So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, but I do think there's also that reciprocity that happens, right? Because we have a host of identities, the other person does, so we can be engaging in them back and forth. And I might have privileges in one area that the other person doesn't, and vice versa. And so they will, I think, occur simultaneously in the same kind of interaction. But going back, I think it's whenever you are having these discussions and it gets stuck on intent, that's hardly going to lead anywhere, right? And it's not going to do anything good for the person who was the recipient of it. And so I think having the impact conversation is the more helpful one to have. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of language and labeling this as implicit bias. When do you think implicit bias can become something more, or if it at all can become something more, such as like racism, homophobia, or sexism? And why is it important to label implicit bias as implicit bias and not something else?
I think because the other ones are things that people are deliberately doing, if I'm hearing correctly. So there's that spectrum, right? So there's the implicit bias, which would be at the level of unawareness, most likely, to the overt things that people are doing, right? If people are actually part of an organization that's a hate group and they're propagating things very intentionally, that might have been built upon initial implicit biases, but now is now part of their aware system of beliefs, their known system of beliefs. And so it's still an implicit bias, but it's one that's now known. So maybe it actually transgresses from being an implicit bias now just to a known bias. Is that answering? Saw another hand, yes.
Yes, I don't know if there's much to be said about this example, but I would be curious. I just finished a novel called Such a Fun Age, and it's about a white woman who employs a young African-American woman, and it is all about microaggressions concerning race and class. And one of the things that this fairly despicable white woman does is to be ultra nice to this young black woman to apparently prove that she's actually not biased.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
is there anything to be said about that other than just
Lots of things to be said about that. So did we hear the question? So it's a novel. There's a white woman and a black woman.
Yes.
And the white woman was being overtly nice and probably conscientious to the black woman to kind of demonstrate the lack of bias, probably, right? And being affirming. I don't want to tell people not to be nice, but I'm sure that black woman probably knew what was going on and that it was an overcompensation, right? And if it's an overcompensation, what's being compensated for? Right? Whenever we act in those disproportionate ways, we are overcompensating or undercompensating for a reason. And it's good to kind of think about, what is that reason? Is it a bias that I know I have? And so maybe that's her way of also doing it, because sometimes when we learn something, we know that we have to overly kind of study it initially, right? When we're learning a new concept, we memorize it, so we read it over and over again, or we apply it, or whatever kind of mechanism we have for learning it, we use. But in that kind of social situation, which I've seen time and time again, and I've been the recipient of as well, I know what's going on. Sometimes I'll be like, maybe that's okay because it's part of their process, but then I also then judge how honest is this interaction, right? How are we really having something that is real here, or is this just more part of the other person's process that now I'm still kind of having to participate in some kind of way? Does that make sense? Okay, great example. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah.
I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the third point that you brought up about kind of helping students when they're facing microaggressions, some of the things that maybe you've done or that you know other faculty or staff have done to help students who are dealing with this.
Well, one thing is, I've done studies on faculty and classroom situations and how they deal with race, and that kind of led automatically to microaggressions and how they are not addressed when they occur in the classroom. So I think that's one thing that faculty should do, is if they notice microaggressions happening, depending on your competency and comfort level, if you're able to do it outright in public in front of the entire class, do it that way. But at least offering support to that student at some point if you notice that a microaggression is happening. If you yourself commit one in front of your classes, which I've done as well, it will serve your students extremely well, and it will be great modeling if you just admit it and talk about what it was and move on. Right? We don't need to spend a whole lot of time either, right? Kind of going into the nuances of it. They can actually just, as long as what we find is that as long as somebody admits that they've done wrong in some kind of way and that they may have caused harm, that sometimes is enough, right? We might need to spend a whole lot of time unpacking it. So that's something that I would do. Even just like teaching students about, again, what they are, number one. That could be relieving by itself. To have a framework and have concepts that make sense of their experiences can be helpful. Letting them know that they have someone to turn to if you are a professor who might want to be that resource. Letting them know that if they don't feel equipped to dialogue with that person because of the various risks involved, or just because honestly sometimes the way that I deal with them now is because of how I've taught myself over time to deal with specific, microaggressive encounters. When you deal with one on the first time, you're stunned so much that you might not even know what to say until moments or hours or days later, but now that you're armed with it. So letting them know that what might be helpful, and what I do is I have a group of people that I go to and talk to about these things right away, either via text or in person, and that could be relieving. So having some place to dialogue about them could be helpful. Getting them out. Now, again, I'm a psychologist, and I believe that we should be airing our emotions and feelings about various things, but that's part of the process, allowing them space to just air their feelings in a non-judgmental way, where we're not placing any value on it, but we're just validating the experience and appreciating, again, their courage for sharing it with us too. Yeah. Any other thoughts? We have a couple minutes. I'm also available afterwards if anybody wants any kind of individual sidebars or what have you. Yeah, cool. Thank you.